Thanks for coming. I'm going to talk today about a couple new papers that I'm working on. They're preliminary, and so I'm really keen to get your advice and to get your reaction to some of the themes that I'm trying to develop and sort of the narrative that I want to tell. So feel free to stop me as we go along. I'm happy to take questions as we go. My title for my talk today is Evidence-Based Policy Analysis, the strange case of RCT's randomized controlled trials for community-led sanitation. I'm playing with some different titles. Randomized controlled trials versus RCT, the limits of evidence-based policy. RCTs confront CLTS. Does the world need a magic toilet? You know, different cuts at this. Let me just say, before I get started, that I have kind of a eclectic hobby. I do cost-benefit analysis of water and sanitation problems. It's kind of a strange thing to do, that there's no market for this. I don't get paid for it much. I get paid for other things, but very few people actually do this. There's probably 10 of us in the world that actually do this, and nobody reads the stuff we write on cost-benefit analysis of water projects. And those that do don't usually like it. I mean, it's not something. There's a little more interest in this. Anil and I are involved with a project at the Harvard School of Public Health funded by the Gates Foundation. The Gates Foundation has been, maybe reluctantly, but moving more toward the use of cost-benefit analysis for environment and health and development interventions. I think gradually realizing some of the limits of cost-effectiveness analysis in the field. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some cost-benefit calculations that I've done on sanitation today. I'm going to talk, for those in the audience that don't know about community-led total sanitation, I'm going to say a few words about it just to update you. 10 years ago, the Gates Foundation started funding a series of randomized controlled trials of sanitation interventions, and I'm going to talk about the results of those. So most of these are just in, and I'm going to talk about some of those results and the implications. I'm going to show you some of my cost-benefit calculations. And I'll come back to this issue of policy advice, what the researchers have said about the implications of their work, and I'll reflect on those with you. I've got some concluding remarks. It's been 10 years ago that the British Medical Journal had a poll. They polled their readers and asked them what was the biggest, most important medical milestone in the last 150 years. There's a lot of amazing things, antibiotics, but the vote was that sanitation was the greatest, improved sanitation was the greatest medical milestone since 1840. So if it was the greatest thing that has happened since 1940, it seems kind of silly to think about doing cost-benefit calculations for this. It must be obvious that the benefits are much greater than the cost, that this was the best thing that we've discovered in the medical field. But it's a little more complicated than that. That's what I want to show you today. Ariel was giving you some estimates of people without improved water and sanitation. There's 1 billion people in the world today that defecate in the open. That's kind of the worst case in terms of sanitation policy. This is a chart that shows you where most of these people are in both urban and rural areas, and you can see that the problems are concentrated here in South Asia and Africa. This is rural open defecation, and the light colors here again show you in rural areas where the big problems are. It's mostly India and South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. It's not the only places where it happens, but those are the big the big problem areas. How to solve that problem is not something that the Gates Foundation just thought of recently. We've been working on this problem for almost 70 years, the donor community, and it's been a really tough problem. And there have been several policy interventions that people have argued for over the last 50, 70 years. There was a whole period where we looked at appropriate technology, and a lot of effort went into creating better latrines. And we thought, if we gave people or designed better latrines, people would adopt the latrines, and that would solve the problem. So this is a picture of one of the improved latrines. Sometimes that worked, a lot of times it didn't. Another strategy was to subsidize latrine construction, and this was tried for decades in South Asia without a lot of success. The health professionals, I teach in a school of public health, thought the solution would be to teach people about the links between a contaminated environment, the transmission of pathogens, and public health benefits. And so there's a lot of public health education programs in these areas. They didn't really work either. So economists would argue that perhaps you should tax a negative externality, but there's never been any support for taxing poor people to defecate in the open, right? So, you couldn't do that. You couldn't defecate in the open here at Riverside. That wouldn't be allowed. But the prohibition choice is not really a policy option either. So we were kind of stuck. We realized that this is a big problem, but we just didn't have any policy tools to tackle it. And then, part of the problem was that behavior was so hard to change. It turns out that people like to defecate in the open. They prefer it, right? So, not all women. That's true. Not all women, but there is often a desire not to defecate in poorly constructed, smelly latrines with a lot of flies. If women had a safe place out in the fields, but that's often hard. So anyway, this has been a really tough problem for the policy analysts. There's not a lot of debate that we would like to clean up the problem. The question was, what tools do we have to do it? What policy interventions do we have? And it's a big problem from a policy point of view. India launched a major effort. India's been involved in this problem for the last 30 years, but there was another push from the Prime Minister Modi just 5 years ago. He had this is almost like a dream for the WASH people, is to have the Prime Minister initiate a big policy initiative, right? You're always trying to convince the finance ministry or somebody else that problems in your sector are important. And this is the Prime Minister sort of launching this drive as one of his signature programs. So the WASH people were, water and sanitation people, were very excited, to have such strong political support. But what were they going to do? what were their instruments? I don't know if you follow the press on this. There's a lot of excitement that this is making great progress. The World Bank and others report that this program's a big success. I don't believe it. I'm quite skeptical of the results, but I hope I'm wrong. So let me tell you a little bit about community-led total sanitation. This is an alternative policy intervention. It was invented by a man named Kamal Kar in 1999 in Bangladesh, and it turned economists and health professionals' policy advice on its head. What Kamal Kar said, was that everything you're doing is wrong. We shouldn't subsidize latrines. And we shouldn't try to educate people, we should try to shame them. And make them realize how awful it was, what they were doing, defecating in the open. And he developed a set of community interventions to try to change human behavior at the community level. It's a participatory approach, and if you talk to Kamal Kar, one of the key insights is he said you have to change community behavior, not just household behavior, and it should be flexible to local conditions. So there's a series of components here that are required. You know, the team that's doing the community-led total sanitation meets with village leaders, they collect baseline information, and then there's what they call a triggering event. There's a series of community activities that are designed to help people understand the risk of what they're doing and to develop some kind of disgust with their sanitation practices. There's a bunch of different things, but I'll just give you a couple of examples. They do a calculation called a shitload calculation, and that's not my word, that's their word, to actually demonstrate to people how much shit is being generated every day, every week, every month in their village. And then they do a mapping exercise where they walk through the village to find the places where people are defecating. They put little flags, you know, on the open defecation sites. There's another exercise, for example, where they have a community meeting and they're talking about sanitation practices, and they put a plate of excrement on the table and they put a plate of food, 2 plates on the table. And the flies, of course, go back and forth and back and forth, and then they, at the end of the meeting, they offer the plate of food to people, you know, but it's obvious that the flies have been carrying the excrement back. So, you know, people are disgusted with the idea of eating. So these are the kinds of things that they're doing. Here's Kamal Kar. There's a whole literature on this community-led total sanitation intervention. There's a mapping exercise where they draw maps of open defecation sites. They walk through the forest and try to identify where people are defecating. So there was a lot of excitement about this policy intervention, and the question for the sector was, does it work? And Kamal Kar said, yes, it works. If you're interested, I've got a bunch of YouTube videos with Kamal Kar where he talks about this innovation and how he discovered it and how important it is. And so about 10 years ago, as this community-led total sanitation initiative rolled out all over the globe, again, people were so excited about it because it didn't have any other policy interventions that would address this problem. The Gates Foundation and others really wanted to look carefully at what the consequences of the intervention were. So if you went to a sanitation conference 10 years ago, the Gates Foundation, the kind of message was, don't worry, we're going to figure this out. We're going to tell you the answer to the question of whether community-led total sanitation is going to work. We're going to fund randomized controlled trials all over the world with some of the very best researchers globally, and that's what they did. And the results are just coming in. They're not really what people expected. So I want to talk a little bit about the results of these trials. Harlow Sheckley was an astronomer at Harvard, early part of the 20th century. He said, hypothesis or theory is clear, decisive, and positive, but it's believed by no one but the man who created it. Experimental findings, on the other hand, are messy, inexact things which are believed by everyone except the person that did the work. So when we're going to look at these experimental findings, and they are quite messy. There are actually 14 of these randomized controlled trials, and I can't go through each of them, but I want to give you a picture of what they have done for people in the sector that are involved in sanitation. There are 11 of these that were that actually evaluated CLTS, or something like CLTS, a CLTS inspired, I'll say. The problem with all the interventions are not exactly the same. I mean, so they're related, but they're not the same. 3 of them, and these were Gates Foundation funded, evaluated an intervention that included an educational component and a provision of hardware, not a CLTS, but a package of sanitation interventions. They were done in Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, right where you would want them to be. 4 were done in India, 2 in Bangladesh, 1 in Indonesia. And then in Sub-Saharan Africa, there's 1 in Kenya, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, Mali, and Ghana. I don't know exactly how much they cost, but $100 million is not, it's ballpark. A lot of money was spent on these RCTs. They were evaluated 1 or 2 years after the intervention. Only 1 of them has any long-term data, and that was by Subrendhu Patnaik at Duke and his colleagues. And the results for the long term showed decreasing effectiveness. Again, the studies are not so easy to compare. The unit of analysis is not the same in every one of the RCTs, but 9 of them only included households with children. The logic was you really want to look at the effects on young kids of the sanitation contamination. Sample sizes were big. 10 of the studies included control and sanitation only arms of 1,500 to 3,000 households, so they were big sizes. Sampling strategy differed. So some of them had purposely selected villages. They relied on leaders' willingness to participate. Some of them were done close to highways for logistical reasons. Some of them had low levels of latrine coverage initially. Some of them had high levels of latrine coverage initially. So there's a lot going on, a lot of moving pieces in these RCTs, not so easy. They differed somewhat in the interventions that they evaluated. Some of them did a traditional CLTS intervention. Some of them actually experimented with who actually implemented the CLTS intervention, whether it was health workers or teachers. Some of them combined monetary prizes, which was not part of the original methodology. 4 studies focused on India's total sanitation campaign, which included subsidies, and Kamal Kar argued strenuously that you don't want subsidies. So that was not part of the original CLTS package. Indonesia, actually, they added some sanitation marketing material and options to see on the supply side interventions mattered. There were 2 programs in Bangladesh. One of them actually had different arms for differing latrine subsidies. And then these 3 programs in Zimbabwe, Kenya, and Bangladesh, again, Gates Foundation funded, they had treatment households that received education programs and sanitation projects. Yes, Neil?
What outcomes were they looking at? Were they just utilization of the toilets, or
outcomes.
Was it health and nutritional outcomes?
Outcomes. My next slide. Lots of different outcomes. And that's what I want to talk about. 6 of them focused on latrine construction, latrine use, and reduction in open defecation. But most of them had multiple outcomes, but they didn't all have the same outcomes. 7 of them had reduction in childhood diarrhea. 4 of them had stunting measurements, height for age measures. 3 of them had upper arm circumference. 5 of them had head circumference. 3 had anemia. 3 had acute respiratory infections, and 3 had worms and helminth infections, egg counts. Some of them had multiple outcome measures, but yes.
How were the units randomized? Was it cluster randomized?
Again, different strategies. The Gates Foundation were cluster randomized. Yeah, good question. That's been one of the criticisms. The argument was that at the time that the Gates Foundation were designed, that most of the contamination that young children and infants were exposed to were within a compound or a close-knit group of households. So that was the logic behind the randomized clusters, but they weren't randomized for whole villages. So, you know, that's been a criticism of whether they should have been bigger units of analysis here than the clusters. So we got a lot of different outcome variables. And let me just sort of show you what the logic here is. So here's the intervention, community-led sanitation. The first link in the causal chain is that because of the community-led sanitation, people will construct latrines. So that's their first outcome measure. Now, if they build latrines, the next thing you want to see is use. I mean, you don't want people building latrines and not using them. So you want to demonstrate use. Then you could also see if they use them, if that stopped open defecation. One of the things that people were concerned about, and actually happened, is that people built latrines, used latrines, but didn't use them all the time. Or some of the household members would use latrines and some wouldn't. So that was a critical piece. Then the question was, well, would the end of open defecation change community norms? And then would the latrine usage and the community norms change health outcomes? So there's health outcomes, and now there are different measures of health outcomes, as I showed you. There's a bunch of, these are all, you know, all of these are different health outcomes. And there's also non-health outcomes. Yes, please.
I'm just curious, what is head circumference? If you go back to one of the outcomes, what has that got to do with
Which one?
studies head circumference?
Fourth up from the bottom.
Head circumference. It's another measure of stunting. I mean, the argument was that infants and young children were so heavily exposed to pathogens of multiple types that they couldn't take in nutrition, they were stunted, and you could measure stunting either with height up to age, or you could measure stunting with head circumference or arm circumference, or all different measures of stunting.
And that's connected with the latrine issue?
Well, that was what the randomized controlled trials were about. The question was, would improving the sanitation conditions reduce stunting? There was observational data by Dean Spears now at the University of Texas from India, which provided what appeared to be compelling evidence that stunting was correlated with sanitation conditions in India. And the hypothesis was it was because of this high pathogen load that was causing the stunting.
So the idea is that, you know, open defecation results in consistent and very extensive diarrhea of infections, and that in turn stunts the child's growth.
That's one pathway. The other pathways are through food and ingestion of dirt, and but there was a heavy pathogen load that the hope was that improved sanitation would break this cycle, and it looked like from the observational data that would be true. Right. And I just mentioned something else. I mean, there are non-health outcomes here. And the big one is time savings by women and children not walking outside the village to defecate, and so there would be some labor supply effects here. But if you look at the literature here, a lot of people looked at latrine construction. There's a bunch that looked at latrine use, not much on community norms, And then we have quite a few looking at health outcomes, but not everybody. This is a list of the RCTs. They were conducted from 2009 to, well, some of them are still being published. These are the ones through 2017. I'm going to summarize these results, but the link between CLTS and latrine construction, if you look at the treatment effect here in the different studies, most of this is positive, but I would, the stars are for statistical significance, but I would characterize that the size of most of the treatment effects is relatively small. So if I were to pick this one here, the control at inline had 22% of the households without latrine, or with latrines, and the inline had 19. Well, that was statistically significant, but there's still a lot of people without latrines. So there's evidence of an effect on latrine construction, but most of the effects are small. But there's a lot of heterogeneity. If you look at latrine use, again, the treatment effects, are statistically significant, but I would characterize them as small. This is another one here, 84% under the controls, 75% in the treatment, statistically significant, but not, this didn't eliminate the open defecation. It's a positive effect. So what do we expect this to do on health? Again, a lot of studies. I'm trying to just summarize for you some of the key insights. There are 10 studies that looked at reduction in childhood diarrhea. Only 3 of them found statistically significant and what I would characterize as small decreases. There are 10 studies that measured child height for age. Only 3 found statistically significant increases due to the sanitation intervention. The 3 studies for upper arm circumference, only 1 found statistically significant increases. And again, the magnitudes were small, in my interpretation. 5 studies measured head circumference, nothing. Anemia, nothing. Acute respiratory infections, nothing. And helminth infections, nothing. So this was really depressing for the people in the WASH sector who thought they had the intervention that was going to solve this problem. So what went wrong? Well, imagine if you had these results for an FDA clinical trial for a new drug. FDA would just send the pharmaceutical company back to the drawing board, right? Nothing here. Even the ones that have treatment effects are small. So, this would be considered a big failure if it was a pharmaceutical trial. It's not exactly how it's been digested in the WASH sector. But what went wrong? The researchers have a lot of different hypotheses here about the problems. One is just that Kamal Carr would say, well, you didn't do it right. You didn't understand how to do CLTS. But this is a problem in terms of scaling up. And these are still experimental results. It's not a national rollout. So that's one hypothesis, that the researchers just had the wrong intervention. I think a more plausible story is that the total pathogen load in many of these communities was just too high. Even the reductions that occurred are just too small. Another hypothesis is that you never had enough people in the villages building latrines. So you weren't able to capture positive externalities from having everybody in the community build latrines. So there's that. The baseline conditions issue has been a big source of debate. These results, many of them were published in Lancet, and there's a series of comments by various people about baseline conditions, but it could be that CLTS is going to be less effective where baseline incidence is low. Many of the studies were, the sites were selected because they thought diarrhea incidence would be high, but that wasn't always true. It didn't come out in every case that the trials were done where diarrhea was high. Sometimes the baseline conditions, latrine coverage is high. People already had poor latrines. The trial gave them improved latrines, but they were not open defecating. They already had pent latrines. Another hypothesis that a lot of people are talking about is the presence of animal feces in the communities. There's people worrying about financial barriers to poor people, poor latrine quality, construction. But none of this really are easily addressed with any new policy levers. I mean, these were lots of different studies by skilled researchers, and we've got very low problem, very low treatment effects. So I want to try to just give you some initial reactions, my own to some of these findings. The RCTs, for people in public policy school, they really were designed without a policy framework. I mean, the idea was that the evidence-based policy was that they expected to find big treatment effects, and then if there were big treatment effects, that was going to be sufficient evidence to roll out CLTS on a big scale. But if that was not true, and the treatment effects were small, they really had no sort of policy model. There was no effort to collect the other data that you would need for a cost-benefit analysis. They were really relying on the size of the treatment effect. And the idea, again, if you had a big treatment effect, there was no need to do cost-benefit analysis because it would be obvious what the answer was. The evaluations were also conducted at too small a scale, really, for regional assessment. So, and I'm going to try to address that with the cost-benefit analysis. So after all of this work, maybe $100 million, there's still a huge amount of uncertainty about the CLTS interventions, both health outcomes and non-health outcomes. So what do we do? I want to show you some cost-benefit results. This is my hobby, doing these things. There have been a bunch of other cost-benefit studies of sanitation interventions, and I just want to call your attention to this column. Some of these are mine. I've got a few of them here. But the cost-benefit ratios are very high in general. So most people, sort of following up on the British Medical Journal, assumed there's really no need to do cost-benefit analysis because it's obvious that this is such a great thing to do. But they didn't have the new results from the RCTs, which are, where the treatment effects are much smaller. Yeah, Neil?
I think it might be useful if you, for the benefit of those people in the audience who are not exactly familiar with what a PCR means,
Yeah.
would you interpret a number like, say, 5.5?
5. That means the benefits are 5 times the cost.
So if you invest $1,
If you invest $1, you get benefits of $5. So that looks like a really good deal. And so now, not all of them came up with those high numbers, but the general sense in the sector was that doing cost-benefit analysis was useless here because everybody knew that this was such a critical intervention. So what did I do? And my colleagues, what's different about the results I want to show you is that we took into account this new evidence from the RCTs. We also had new data on program cost, the cost of delivering the CLTS intervention, and we conducted this analysis at a regional scale. So these are new results. We did them for a hypothetical rural district in sub-Saharan Africa. So our cost-benefit model has 52 parameters. We picked parameter values that are typical for sub-Saharan Africa as best we could. I'm going to show you results for a district that we said had 200 villages. Each village has 100 households. Each household has 5 members. And basically what I'm going to do on the benefit side, I take account of the mortality reduction benefits. Those are the lives saved by the intervention. If I roll out a CLTS intervention in this hypothetical district, I've got morbidity reduction. This is the cost of getting sick but not dying, and the medical expenses I would pay if I did get sick. And also the value of the time savings. The costs are the costs of delivering the CLTS program, the costs of latrine construction, and the household time costs of participating in the program. Those are the key components of the cost-benefit calculation. Here's some results. So even with the RCT treatment effects that we've seen, the benefits are generally bigger than the cost, but the cost-benefit ratio is relatively small. Internal rate of return is about 9%. So this would pass a cost-benefit test, but it's not all that exciting. If you think about what other things people could be doing in these poor villages, they have many other investment alternatives that will probably look more attractive than this sanitation alternative. If this is a breakdown over 10 years, I just want to give you an idea of the magnitude of some of the benefit estimates. These are the deaths avoided in all villages over 10 years with these new treatment effects. So if I roll out this community-led total sanitation intervention, over 10 years, I guess I'll save about 14 lives in all 100 villages. I don't know if you think that's a big number or a little number. It's not nearly as many lives saved as the people in the wash sector had hoped. But I save a lot of hours of time not walking to open defecation sites. We've also done some sensitivity analysis of these cost-benefit results. And what I want you to just see here is that there are all kinds of local combinations where you'll get a cost-benefit ratio less than 1. So there's plenty of local conditions where this is not going to work. And even if you get a positive cost-benefit ratio, again, chances are it's not so big. So when we incorporate these findings from the RCTs into a benefit cost framework, you know, the net benefits are probably positive, but they're quite modest, and there's lots of heterogeneity. And the heterogeneity means that there are going to be lots of villages where nothing happens. You know, you roll out this this intervention and nothing. We think that the empirical evidence looks like that it will work some places, but there's going to be a lot of heterogeneity in where this works. The other thing that we found in doing the benefit cost calculations is that this issue of positive sanitation health externalities is not nearly as great as people expected in terms of the benefit cost results. So that was a bit of a surprise, and the reason is that it doesn't kick very many villages past a threshold where you really get the positive sanitation externalities. So this is a sort of complex sort of policy picture. I want to go back now and look at what the researchers in the RCT said about how did they interpret the policy advice from their studies. Yeah, so I'll talk about how I interpret it, but this is what they said when after they got the results. Well, there's the optimist. I characterize these people as sort of saying, well, the glass is half empty or half full. They'll say it's half full. You know, small treatment effects are better than nothing. A well-designed and coordinated program that includes even minimal financial support can have a substantial impact. The question is, what's substantial? I think it's a small impact. The CLTS component was successful due to its confrontational approach. I don't think it was successful. I mean, but you know, that's how the researchers, you know, some of the researchers are interpreting these small treatment effects as positive.
What's the confrontational approach? Is that you've got to do this?
No, it's shaming people.
Oh, okay, that.
Yeah,
Okay.
shaming people. So the health professionals, well, some of the conclusions they drew were more intensive interventions are needed. You know, in other words, the interventions that were tested in the randomized controlled trials weren't intensive enough. We should have sent the community organizers back into the village twice as much. Well, that's also more expensive, and we don't know if it would work. I mean, but you know, their interpretation was that the interventions were not good enough. And the other thing they said was, well, the limited results are evidence of the difficulty in achieving high enough sanitation coverage to realize health benefits. I agree with that. Small treatment effects, many of them not statistically significant. But then they said, well, CLTS may still be valuable as it has other social benefits. Like women don't have to experience the violence and so forth, right? Yeah, but they didn't quantify that. They didn't measure that in the RCTs, right? So they're saying, well, maybe there are other outcomes. This is more from the health professionals. Nevertheless, nevertheless means despite the small treatment effects and lack of statistical significance, we feel strongly that these findings should not diminish ongoing ambitious efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. There are myriad health, equity, and ethical arguments motivate the elimination of open defecation and ample supply of microbiologically safe water, even in the absence of a strong link to growth. But the evidence here from the RCDs doesn't suggest that this is a way of solving open defecation. It's not just health. I mean, we don't get the benefits. Well, this is kind of, let's do it anyway. Again, if it was an FDA drug trial, you wouldn't say, I will just do it anyway, you know. Or there are other things I didn't measure, but, you know, let's just go ahead. The economists, they said, well, there are positive externalities. So let's do it anyway. The RCTs were not designed to measure the positive externalities, and so there's no evidence of positive externalities. So really hard to say, you know, but I'm not convinced that that's an answer.
So what's a positive externality in this case? Like,
Yeah.
go to school more often?
Not, well, that's a possibility. But the externality is if all of us build latrines, you'll experience a cleaner environment, right? So there'll be a spillover from my actions onto yours. You'll have a lower pathogen load because of what we do.
Almost like a general equilibrium.
Yeah, yeah. And everybody says more research is needed. They just spent $100 million, you know. I mean, you got to call it a day at some point and look at your results, right? But no, everybody wants more money. And these things take a very long time, you know. I mean, so, you know, but you should expect everybody wants more money. Some people are calling for new and innovative innovations that require less behavioral change. This is sort of the Gates Foundation magic toilet. You know, we need new technology here. We don't have interventions that are going to work. We need, but do you think that's right? Do we really need new technology? I mean, don't we actually know what's needed here? It's just not in the wash sector itself. I'll show you what works. This is a slum in Singapore in 1960. They had high pathogen loads, and they had poor health conditions. And, you know, there were efforts to improve water and sanitation conditions in these slums, but Lee Kuan Yew, what did he do? He cleared the slums. Now in the U.S., I mean, we have an aversion now to sort of urban renewal kinds of programs from some of the social consequences, but we know how to solve these problems. We just deliver water and sanitation in better housing. And those are some of the housing, public housing, the early public housing in Singapore that Lee Kuan Yew built. This is Tong Baru. It's now one of the hippest places in Singapore. But the housing was actually very simple, very small flats, but they had indoor plumbing and sewage. So we moved people out of those slums and gave them, in Singapore, subsidized housing. And those flats, those simple little flats now are worth about $1 million US. They're built in the 60s, so they're quite old. They need a lot of work. But that's what it takes. I mean, it may just be that there are no solutions if people live in these kinds of conditions. I mean, that's to me what the RCTs are telling us here. I'm not sure that there's going to be an innovative solution to reduce pathogen loads enough in these kinds of conditions to have large health impacts. So what the water people don't talk about is the importance of mortgage finance or subsidized housing. I mean, to solve this problem, you need a broader vision. You need to think about water and sanitation in the context of improved housing. I'm not saying that that's easy. I'm not saying it's financially feasible to give people subsidized housing. I know how hard that is, but when people talk about innovative technologies, I mean, we know this works. I think we know. I mean, we don't have the kind of pathogen loads anywhere in Riverside, and they don't have them in Singapore either. Once you get sanitation and water inside housing, you solve this problem. So from my perspective, you know, we've been looking in the wrong place to try to find solutions for this. There may be no easy solutions here. We've been looking for 70 years for solutions to this problem. We know that works. That's where we ought to be headed. The other thing that I would say, as I'll conclude here, is that as academics and as researchers, we always want our results to have global importance. But what the RCTs really show us is that there's so much heterogeneity at local levels that really we should be trying to solve situations in local conditions. We should be doing research in Cape Town and Nairobi and Lagos that are suitable for Lagos and solving the problem in Lagos. The idea that we want to do an RCT, or the Gates Foundation wants to fund 3 RCTs or 7 RCTs, and that's going to show us what to do globally, I think is just overly ambitious. I mean, we need to be doing on-site research and figuring out what should be done in particular places. And that's actually good news for students in a public policy program like here, because you know, there's going to be a lot of expertise is going to be required to figure out what needs to happen in Lagos. And that really requires a lot of understanding of local conditions, local customs, and making things work at a local level. You know, the idea that, the only thing that matters is having an RCT that I can generalize over the world. I think, that's not realistic. So I'll stop here and take questions.
Thank you very much.
questions?
So I had, okay.
Kurt?
Thanks, Dale, really enjoyed it. So I'm wondering, in terms of, it's often hard to change adult behavior, but it seems easier to change children's behavior over time. If you were to take this out a generation, I mean, before the buildings are installed, might you get a different benefit cost ratio in that sense for increased uptake? So in a dynamic setting, you might get a different result versus a snapshot right now.
It's a hypothesis, I guess we don't know.
Yeah, so it would require a longer investment in terms of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of effort to try to change sanitation behavior in schools. And then the idea would be that children would take those practices home.
So
And
imagine when we were told not to brush our,
Right.
turn the faucet off, right?
Right.
The first generation said, forget it, I'm gonna continue to run
Yeah,
the
yeah.
water, but their
Yeah.
children behave differently.
I think it's a good question. These RCDs were not targeted at interventions that change children's behavior, but maybe that's the next step. It'd be a very long-term sort of effort, right? I mean, Singapore solved this problem in basically 10, 20 years, right? I mean, of course, they're unique, and it's not so easy to move from Singapore to rural India. I know all that. I mean, but the idea that we need a magic bullet here or a magic toilet is not, it's not obvious to me that that's the answer.
Thank you for your presentation. Since you kept mentioning Lagos, let me put it on the table. I grew up partly in Lagos, Nigeria. There are two key issues, maybe not necessarily directly your work, but from what I can sense or tease out of the literature in your presentation. It's not my area of work, but I do dabble into policy analysis. There are two key challenges. Number one, there is no discussion that, at least I can see, that deals with land tenure issues. Land tenure issues. If I own the land, if I own the space, there is a strong likelihood I'll become interested in how to maintain it. Lagos is a no man's land. Second, when I was growing up in Lagos in the late 70s, most of us preferred to go back to the village. I'm a village man. There are cultural issues that were on the ground. When you talk about public opprobrium or shaming people, that was embedded in the culture of my people. The age grades came out and we are given responsibilities. The women's age grade, this is your responsibility. You have to keep our waters clean. You have to wash. You have to keep the latrine community-based. That's what got me interested in this.
Yeah.
They were so clean, you didn't want to live in Lagos. And I didn't see the kind of negative health issues in the village, at least where I come from. And the last time I was there was 2 years ago. So having a conversation within the village with the people that live there, asking them specifically, what are the challenges that you see? How might we work with you to resolve the problem? This might be one of the things that will lead to policy, more general policy discussion and implementation. But coming in, we think you need a new latrine, and we think it should look like this or like that, without thinking whether the village is bordered by conflict zones, whether there are conflicts between villages that will lead to people behaving differently. Without thinking about those things, you come out with conclusions that in reality may not apply.
Good. It's a good comment. There's no. Well, I agree with you that it's a very. It reinforces my point about looking at local conditions. I mean, I would say you do a randomized control trial in rural Nigeria. You know, to try to extrapolate those results to India might be a mistake. You know.
Okay, last question.
You know what, that's a great story. I'm so glad I got to hear it. I wondered a couple things. One is, if you've thought about whether this kind of phenomenon happens other times where people go off in this direction and tinker around with all this stuff that isn't the real phenomenon. And if there would be a name to name when that happens. And because it should be something we try to avoid. Then the other thing I wondered about was whether there's any thought in your mind that this phenomenon is in any way, do people do it on purpose to avoid the major problem? Because it's easier supposedly to deal with, or less politically fraught. Or, you know, do we have to solve some inequality problem to get the houses to look like that? You know, those kinds of things.
Interesting question. I like your first comment about sort of, is this a kind of generic problem that we should be thinking about? And I think the answer, maybe yes. I think that it's very easy to think about evidence-based policy as the simple establishment of a causal link, you know, between an intervention and some simple outcome. But most policy analysis is more complicated than that for reasons of inequality, politics, and actually getting the outcome measure right. So it seemed to me that there really wasn't a policy analytic framework in mind here. I mean, it was just the sort of hope that if we established a causal link, we wouldn't have to do the cost-benefit analysis. We wouldn't have to look at it. We didn't have to look at it again. It was going to be obvious that we could just mobilize the global community to do this. But that's not how it turned out, and there was no fallback plan. What's so striking to me is that in my cost-benefit model, I said I had 52 parameters. You know, one of them is the size of the treatment effect that were measured in the RCTs, but all of these RCTs were out in the field, and they could have measured the other 51 for me very, very easily and cheaply. But there was no effort to do that. There was no link between the health professionals and schools like this. You know, people really doing policy analysis. I mean, it was a very simple kind of policy model. And you know, I think that's a big lesson in my mind.
But there was, if I may just intervene for a second, you did refer to some of your own work in this willingness to pay. And what struck me about some of the work that you have done is that when you actually go and ask households how much they are willing to pay for clean water or for sanitation, it's surprisingly very little.
Yeah.
And a lot of recent work also seems to suggest that
Yeah.
you know, if people have additional resources, they would rather go and buy a cell phone in Africa or in India rather than invest that money in something like a toilet or clean water.
And of course, the health professionals would say,
How do you react to that?
well, they would say, well, you know, that may be true, but that's misguided. I mean, those are the preferences we need to change. And behind that desire to change the preferences was an idea that all of these wash interventions in rural areas were going to work and deliver health benefits. And now these RCTs really call that into question. I mean, you know, maybe the local people are right. You know, until they get better housing and stuff, you know, maybe they know more than, you know, the professors, you know, I mean, about, you know. Okay, sorry.
We have to stop because people are running to classes. The only thing that I would say, I mean, that the reason for people preferring telephone is the hope that one day somebody will develop an app that will make the telephone being able to provide the services for the parents. Thank you very much.